welcome back to my channel. I'm really excited to be back riding here in 2021 for the first time. I've got in front of me this Honda CB300R, specifically the 2019 model. So we're going to take it for our first ride here today. Pretty standard Honda key. Looks pretty much identical to the 2017 CB300R 500R key that I had. Yeah, I'm really pumped about this riding season. It's pretty cold here today. Looking at about 5 degrees Celsius, which is just around 40 Fahrenheit, I think. I love the way it looks. This LED rounded headlight here. This kind of matte black. Yeah, I'm just going to be sharing my initial impressions on this bike. I always like to look at things from a beginner's perspective, or even if you're a more advanced rider or novice rider looking for something just to commute on that's great on gas and really light and flickable in the city. I try to look at all bikes from that perspective. So let's face it, honestly, the Honda CB300 as well as the CB300F, I think it was in pretty dire need of a refresh. Kawasaki came out with the Z400 and the Ninja 400. Yamaha has the MT-03, which is a naked version of the R3. And I really think the ball was in Honda's court to get something going in the beginner bike or lower CC class. So they had this refresh. Really like the way it sounds. I'm not sure if you can hear me over the exhaust. The ball was in Honda's court, and while engine displacement and power was never a strong suit for the Hondas compared to the competitors, I can tell you that the CB300R is the lightest in the class, so somewhere around 317 pounds, and you can definitely feel it when you're flicking this thing around. My first bike was a CB250R, so this one has that 286C motor from Honda, the same one I believe in the CRF 300L. That's just starting to make its way over to North America. It's got a decent amount of power, especially if you're doing urban riding like what I do mostly. It's gonna do the job, but I mean, this does depend on rider weight, rider height, all of that stuff too. So again, this is the smallest version here in North America, the 300R. In Europe, I believe there's the CB125R. Next up would be the CB650R, which is a 4-cylinder. And then lastly is the CB1000R. So they don't have anything to fill that gap. It's still the CB500F that Honda is throwing around. So I think it'd be a pretty nice bike if this, Neo Cafe styling, as they call it, was offered in a 500 engine, but I would guess maybe in 2022 we can expect that. I'm not sure if the microphone is picking this up, but it's got a pretty squeaky clutch lever right now, so I gotta deal with that. Again, this is me just kind of getting to know this bike, and already I can feel it's quite an improvement over my CBR250R, just that extra CCs, with this 286 motor, and I've always liked single cylinders, so that's another differentiating factor between the Yamaha and the Kawasaki, which have twins. This is a thumper, so I really like how that sounds. You do get most of the power, I would say, down low in the low RPM range. In a nutshell, just describing this bike, it feels like a big Grom. It feels like the Grom's bigger sibling or older cousin or whatever you want to call it, but especially the SF. I'm new to the SF. I had an OG for a while here, but yeah, this definitely feels like a big Grom. The handlebars obviously are wider. They're not as raised, but overall the ergonomics, it might be a little bit more aggressive than the Grom, but you know, I feel pretty good on it. With naked bikes, of course, you don't really get a whole lot of wind deflection here up front. But Honda refreshed the display a bit. I'm going to start talking about some beginner bike considerations after this. So it's definitely doing 100 kilometers an hour, no problem. Looks like I'm averaging around 2.7 liters per 100 kilometers. They added a shift light, which is something interesting. I'm not sure if it came on, but it's some lights up here. If you end up higher, maybe around 7,000 RPM or higher, they'll start going off and it'll tell you when to shift, which is neat, but I don't know how much I would really use that as a beginner. It does not have a gear position indicator, which is a very typical Honda thing to do. I'm someone who doesn't really rely on a gear position indicator, but it's always a nice to have, really, like when you're downshifting and you're doing a lot of city riding, and then especially for beginners when they're learning and just hanging around in first, second, and third gear. That would have been nice to have if Honda is specifically marketing this to a beginner rider. Not essential, but just something to keep in mind. There is the side stand indicator, so if you have the side stand still down, it'll let you know, similar to the Ducati Scrambler I have. It's got a clock. It's got all your fuel economy calculations, trip A, trip B, the typical stuff. Fuel gauge is telling me I'm near empty, I know. Overall styling of the bike, I think it looks great. So with the LED lighting, I think it looks like a fantastic, you know, kind of like a modern cafe take on the looks. I'm a big fan, with the exception of that incredibly long rear fender to hold the plate. So I normally don't complain about that. I know a lot of riders do. They always get the tail tidies. Instead of that side stand indicator, it would have been nice to have a thermometer to tell me what the external temperature is. Yeah, this thing is very, very light. I haven't ridden the Z400 or the MT-03 yet to compare. I'm hoping to get my hands on either of those this riding season. If power is your main concern, I wouldn't really recommend getting this bike. At the same time though, it has that Honda refinement, that Honda reliability, I would assume. But just overall, you know, my first impressions of how it rides, the brakes bite really nicely. I think this is the bike that will just do the job if you're not too concerned about speed. I mean, it's a 300cc and, well, it's 286. Just getting to and from work, getting to school if you're a college student. One thing to note for beginners is this seat height is pretty tall. I was surprised. Again, I'm a short rider, probably like a 30 or less inch inseam, 5'6", 140 pounds, and I am pretty much tippy-toeing this thing. So that's something that I wasn't too stoked about. I mean, you're only supposed to put one foot down anyways, and I've ridden a CRF 250L, I've owned one, and so I know how to operate tall bikes, but even if you know how to, it's just kind of nice if you're doing a lot of stop and go to be able to flat foot something. Example I'll go back to is the Grom, which is, I think, a smaller version of this. If you're, you know, a shorter beginner rider, maybe look into the MT-03. I think that has the shortest seat height in its class. This one is pretty tall. It doesn't have a gear position indicator, but at the same time, if you love that single cylinder sound, you know, it reminds me a lot of my CRF 250L. I had an FMF Power Core 4 exhaust on that, super loud. There it is. So that single cylinder really reminds me of that. And then on my CBR 250R, my first bike ever, I had a 2 Bros. Overall, I'm pretty impressed with this bike. It's a ton of fun, but you might grow out of it pretty fast as a beginner. If this was even more similar to the Honda Grom in terms of ergonomics and seat height, I think I would consider selling my Grom for this. I know that's a very bold statement, being 100 pounds or so more than the Grom. I'm pretty happy with how it rides. The highway test that we did back there, getting up to speed was no problem. So I'll continue to let you guys know how I feel about this bike moving forward. I'll catch you in another video. If you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop them below and I'll try my best to answer them. If you have requests for a certain bike that you'd like me to review, I'll try my best to get my hands on one of those. But thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace. I wonder how much it's going to cost me to fill up this gas tank.